Hello and welcome back to ERM Advantage. I'm Eric Holmquist. Now we're continuing in our discussion about effective metrics. In the last two videos we talked about how to think about metrics, the different types, each one's purpose, and how best to source them from within our organization to come up with a strong inventory of metrics. Now I'm very excited about this video because we've come to the part you've all been waiting for, how we ultimately document and present our metrics as effectively as possible. Now, to do this, I'm going to be referencing the template that I use and have continued to develop over the last 15 years. This template has a number of tabs, each with its own purpose, so we'll take a quick look at each one. Now, there is no one way to present information. This just happens to be the template that I use. What I'm going to focus on is the principles behind each of these tabs and the related data elements that I like to include and why I think each of those are important. Now, one thing that becomes really obvious pretty quick is that maintaining metrics in a spreadsheet is about the most inefficient way possible. It's cumbersome to maintain, and the fact that this information is much better maintained in like a software solution. Any of your common GRC or IRM solutions has this capability, and there are even some very good standalone tools that you could use just for this purpose. But when starting out or while working through evaluating and documenting key metrics, a spreadsheet can work just fine. But for our purposes, this template will work best so that we can kind of see all the data elements and presentation elements we're working with to be able to reinforce the concepts behind them. But you'll easily see how each of these functional elements can pretty easily be designed into a software solution. Okay, first we're going to go through how we document metrics. Now, unfortunately, this is a step that is often overlooked or minimized, which is truly regrettable because any metric that we're considering using and including in our reports must be properly evaluated and documented. This serves a number of purposes. First, it's an exercise that helps us gut check whether this metric really is meaningful, and we'll see why. Two, it creates a structured process around establishing things like the appropriate limits and related management actions. And three, for preparing other related information that we'll see later needs to be included in our reporting. So let's go through these key data points or metadata associated with all of our key metrics. Now, one thing that's important to understand here is that to many people, the metric owners in particular, this information may seem really obvious. At first, some people may push back saying, what's the point of this? The point is that while the metrics, limits, and how it relates to risk may be obvious to you, it is not obvious to everyone. And one of the most dangerous assumptions that we can make is that everyone interprets information the same way. Guess what? They don't. So that's what makes this part of the exercise so important. So here we go. First, we obviously have our metric name and short description. Now, in most cases, the name tells us what we're measuring, but not always. Next, we have the metric type. Is this a KPI, KRI, KCI, etc.? Now, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but in practice, there are some metrics that could be argued it's a KPI or a KCI. Don't overthink this. Really, this is just helping us put metrics into some of the logical buckets they go in. Now, going back to how we described this in a prior video, this is an imperfect but serviceable way to think about what the metric type is. If it has to do with how we make a dollar, it's probably a KPI, key performance indicator. If it has to do with the threats to making and retaining that dollar, it's probably a KRI, key risk indicator. And if it has to do with our efforts to retain as much of that dollar as possible, or a risk mitigant, then it's probably a KCI, key control indicator. Again, not perfect, but good enough for what we need to use them for. Again, just don't overthink this. We just want to be able to look at our inventory of metrics and make sure that we're not super heavy in one type while ignoring another. Next is metric scope. And again, going back to our prior videos where we characterize different types of metrics, there will be three types. First, department only, originating within a business unit and either just remaining there or, if significant enough, could be reported if only representing that business unit. Second is department roll-up, meaning it's a homogeneous metric that originated within business units but can be aggregated together. And finally, enterprise-wide, metrics that really don't align with a specific business unit, whether it reflects overall performance. Examples might include like return on assets, efficiency ratio, etc. Now, once again, just when we look at our overall universe of metrics, we just want to make sure that we're not heavy-handed in one area, rather we've got a good balance of different types. Next, we want to give some consideration to, is this metric highly quantitative or measurable, semi-quantitative, or really more qualitative? Again, this one isn't usually too controversial. Next is frequency. Again, pretty obvious, but how often is this data point updated, reviewed, reported, etc.? Again, not all metrics are created equal. Some are fine appearing on a monthly or even quarterly scorecard. Some may need to be tracked daily with appropriate management actions defined at various thresholds and then reported later on for information. Again, by documenting the frequency for each metric, it allows for anyone to question whether that frequency is correct or should it be adjusted. For less critical metrics, fine, update it periodically and then include it in the next dashboard. But for one that is highly correlated to a key risk with the potential for change at any time, what ultimately ends up being a periodic report is simply going to be information only, or to discuss trends or root causes, since the implications of its change should have already been dealt with. And the last part of our top-level information is the metric owner. And by that, I mean a person, not a department or a committee that is responsible for this data point. Now, this could split into two people, one who is the preparer, the person who actually tracks and gathers the information its period, but ultimately I want to know who it is that's responsible for the accuracy, integrity, and meaning of this data point. People are responsible, not committees. If the data point is wrong, either deliberately or unintentionally, I want to know who goes out the window. This is also the person that we're going to go to for anyone who doesn't understand the metric or simply needs more information about it. Now, I generally show this by title so that if somebody leaves, we don't have to come in and update the documentation, but you could show the name if you want to, that's fine. You could also optionally show what's the originating business unit where appropriate, that's fine and can be helpful, but I just want to make sure that I know who is the individual that is responsible. Now, we'll start getting deeper into the meat of our documentation, starting with the thresholds for management actions. I happen to be a fan of a 3-level status, a yellow, an orange, and a red, but there's no right or wrong. You can do any levels you want. The reason I like the 3 levels is that it generally corresponds with some version of yellow is keep an eye on it, orange is evaluate it, think about it, and think should we do anything, and then red is something needs to be done. The red, in other words, becomes the guardrail, the thou shalt not pass, and then the others are more intermediates telling you you're heading in the wrong direction. But again, structure your limits and thresholds, however you see fit. Now, most metrics will be quantifiable, so you can use an operator here, a greater than, a less than, equal, and then associate threshold values. I also like to use a visual cue, in this case a box, around any value which is defined by a policy somewhere as noted here. Then along with each of those threshold values, there should also be a very short description about what actions should be taken if the metric hits that threshold. This is going to be different in every case. Again, there may be times when it's simply watch it. There's going to be times when something should be done about it. In the case of more qualitative metrics, rather than listing a threshold value, you would describe more of a threshold state, such as a program that's not being appropriately maintained, etc. Now, we'll look at some examples as we go through the dashboard. Now, as a quick side note here, and this will apply to many of the fields in this template we're looking at, I'm using very, very short little descriptions here, short little notes, just to keep the screen kind of manageable. However, you should expand on these, put in as much information as you want to properly document each of these attributes. Next is metric purpose. Essentially, why is this metric meaningful? Now, we'll get deeper into our discussion around risk correlation later, but for now, what I'm just really looking for is a basic description of why this data point matters, or rather, what could it mean if it's going in the wrong direction? And this is important for people in particular that aren't as familiar with this metric. They need to understand why it matters. Now, for some metrics, this will be ridiculously obvious. If I'm measuring cash position, I don't need somebody to explain it to me why that matters. But not all metrics are as obvious. If I'm measuring, say, surplus ratio or deposit beta or certain quality metrics, I can't automatically assume that everyone understands why that data point matters. People may even think, gosh, I should probably know that, but they're not necessarily going to ask. Nobody likes to look dumb. Let's give them a tool. Let's tell them a little bit about why this metric matters, why we're measuring it, what it could mean. You could even include in that field maybe a link to an external site that could provide additional information about it. And once again, this serves several purposes. At minimum, we're making sure that everyone understands and appreciates the purpose of a metric. Second, our view about why this metric matters represents an assumption. We believe that if this metric changes from X to Y, that may represent a potential risk factor. And as we've discussed throughout this series, one of the most important objectives of the program is bringing out assumptions so they can be challenged. By documenting this belief, this gives us an opportunity for others to question that assumption. It's always possible others don't see that it correlates in the same way that you do. But if this metric and its related limits and thresholds are going to be part of our reporting, we have to be in agreement about what it means and what should be done under various scenarios. The next is our data source and related calculations. In other words, where did this data come from? What system was it sourced from? Was it a software application, someone's spreadsheet, or just somebody's head? Now, at minimum, I at least want to know what system this data point comes from, if only to have the ability to trace it back to that system to verify it. So it really pays to be specific here, because this information may become support for, say, a future data validation. Is this value automatically system generated and we pick it up as it is? Or is it mathematically calculated by someone? If so, what's the source of the data that they're using for their calculation? Or did it start with a system value and then go through some additional manipulation or other calculations to arrive at the value that we're reporting? Unfortunately, people tend to take any value that ends up in a pretty report as always valid, but I've simply seen too many times where someone made a mistake in gathering their data points. If these metrics are significant enough to inform our decision making, then that data has to be right and periodically tested. In fact, I'm actually a very big fan, we've talked about this in a prior video, of making part of our internal audit program back testing of key values in our reports to ensure that they were reported correctly. But if nothing else, I can also say I've seen more than one circumstance where a data value was reported, but once it was disclosed where the data sourced from, people had legitimate and ultimately well-founded concerns. Say, wait, you can't use that system or that data point. This is why we need to be transparent around the data points we're using and where they came from. Next, we want to capture any reference to policies or regulatory requirements that relate to this metric, and specifically any particular threshold values. This helps create connecting points to not only further understand why this metric matters, but also what thresholds should be monitored and any policy-driven management actions. And finally, just identify any type of testing or validation that's done to verify that the data we are getting is sound. A value coming from a system that is subject to periodic back testing is a lot more valuable than one that comes with, look, trust me, it's right. You could certainly also indicate when was the last time that this data point or the source system was tested or validated. Okay. The data points we've been talking about so far are pretty straightforward, no real surprises. Now we're going to talk about the one factor that is more important than all others combined, is almost never captured, and can mean the difference between metrics that matter and metrics that don't, and that is risk correlation. I touched on this briefly in the last video, but now we need to really unpack this, as it means everything to identifying meaningful metrics. The question is, to what degree does this metric, specifically a change to the underlying value we're tracking, correlate to a key risk? In other words, how closely does a change in the metric correlate to a potential future event? And notice I said potential because, as I discussed in the last video, just because a metric has changed doesn't automatically mean the risk is higher. It only means that something has changed. To determine if the risk level has changed, we have to consider why it has changed. So, if you take nothing else from this series on metrics, take this. When it comes to identifying meaningful metrics, including the elusive forward-looking attributes, risk correlation is everything. As I've said before, whether a metric is in any way predictive has nothing to do with the type of metric it is. It has everything to do with its correlation to risk. Now, there are two ways we can think about risk correlation, and this will factor into a number of ways we use this information. Certainly the first and most obvious is how the metric correlates to a potential event. This is where we take a metric, which again is only measuring a single value, and translate that into an actual potential event. In other words, if this metric changes, what does that tell us about the greater or lesser likelihood of this event actually happening? A metric that is only loosely correlated to a potential future event is not a strong predictive indicator. It doesn't mean it isn't meaningful, but a change may not be as meaningful. Conversely, a metric that is highly correlated is a much more valuable smoke detector to us. So to emphasize this, let's just quickly revisit a couple of examples I've mentioned previously. If we track information data security incidents, for instance, do those incidents likely represent a pattern that suggests similar future incidents? Very unlikely. Should we encounter a data event, we're going to go to great lengths to ensure that event will never happen again. Therefore, this is really not reflective of a reoccurrence. On the other hand, take customer complaints. If complaints are showing to be consistently increasing, what are the potential implications? Well, at minimum, the potential for regulatory criticism, also the potential for a loss of customers if the problem remains acute enough. And does the occurrence of increased complaints suggest a higher likelihood of these events continuing to take place? Absolutely. So this activity has a high correlation to potential future events. If complaints are consistently going up, something's not right. Now, the second way we can think about risk correlation, once again, incorporating our risk types into the conversation in a meaningful way, is to think about, should an event occur, what type of risk that might represent. Once again, we're using our various risk type buckets as lenses to help us better understand a risk without being forced into classifying it only one way. A potential event that represents high impact to a range of risk types is inherently more problematic than one is limited to only one or two types. This allows us to consider the full range of impact of an event, which can influence not just our understanding of it, but potentially how we think about mitigating it. So again, let's just look at a couple of quick examples within the template we've been using here. We've been thinking about capital levels. We've been looking at this metric around Tier 1 leverage ratio. From a scenario standpoint, an insufficient level of capital is almost perfectly correlated with the potential for regulatory actions, as well as potential limits on our ability to grow or pursue future new business. So, seen through our risk type lens, this could clearly have an impact on strategic risk by impeding our business, but also a certain amount of operational risk, compliance risk, and even reputation risk, but each to varying degrees. In addition to selecting an estimated correlation strength value, we capture a bit of verbiage to, again, describe how our correlation strength is justified in our mind, again, for the benefit of being challenged. This is important because, as you've heard me say 1,000 times, risk always lies in the assumptions, and these are key assumptions. Documenting them here gives anyone a chance to question those assumptions and whether a given metric really is predictive or not. Let's consider another. Take an operational metric, policy violations. This is one of the best departmental originating metrics, but with the ability to aggregate, that's generally highly correlated to potential risks. A significant increase in repeat policy violations is highly correlated to the potential for process failures and the related consequence of financial, regulatory, or even customer impact. Now, we'll look at some other metrics when we look at the dashboard itself, but this gives us a general idea of the types of information that we're looking to capture in relation to our core metrics. Now, as a quick side note, correlations could be done informally by just an estimation of, do we think this is a low or medium or high? That's fine. You could also build in some mathematical support for that, ultimately coming up with a defined correlation coefficient. That's fine. I think to start, you could just use a general estimation, and later on you could build, again, more precision behind that. Now, all this information that we've gathered here is what we would call the metadata for our metrics. Now, some of this is largely just documentation and reference purposes, but some of it actually has functionality that we can use within our reporting dashboard itself. Yes, I know documentation takes time, but that's a good thing. Slow is how we learn. Think about your golf swing. We don't learn anything by swinging fast and repetitively. We learn by breaking down the swing and considering where we want to be, positioned at various points so we can work on adjustments. Then we can take it back to regular speed. Now, this information should be evaluated and even approved periodically, but absolutely no less than annually, as well as after every update to our risk appetite framework and our enterprise risk assessment. Now, before moving on to our reporting dashboard and all the elements contained within that, I want to show one more tab here, and this is just a simple metrics summary. The advantage of this is what we've done is we've taken our list of metrics and we've put them into the 9 buckets based on the 2 dimensions of its type, is it a KPI, KRI, KCI, as well as its scope, is it enterprise-wide, department roll-up, and departmental. Now, for this dashboard that I'm showing, this is more of an enterprise level. It's the dashboard kind of in relation to our risk appetite, so it's mostly high-level metrics. There's not going to be any department level unless they're really significant. It's going to be all either departmental but rolled together or enterprise-wide. What's good is we look at this and we see where are our metrics sort of grouped. It makes sense that there would be some, but not a lot of the performance indicators. That's really more of a conversation around how are we achieving our plan. Some are meaningful because they do have a potential risk aspect. But what we really want to see is the bulk of our metrics being either KRIs or KCIs. Now, shown here is not only the name of the metric, but a little graphic that shows the relative strength by looking at how highly each metric is correlated to risk. This is a good visual way to sort of look at our list and say, do I have a good representation of high correlation metrics, or am I weak in an area where I'm using a bunch of really low correlation ones? Again, just a way of kind of gut checking our inventory and making sure we've got a good balanced representation. Okay, this is good. We've taken a look at all the supporting information and related information. Now let's take a look at how we actually report this information. Okay, so as we take a look at an example dashboard here, I just want to reiterate that there is no one way to present information. This just happens to be a template that I've used for a lot of years. It works well, but again, you can use any format you want. I'm really going to be focusing on mainly some of the little component pieces that I think are particularly helpful and useful. Now, regardless of the format you use, the goal with any particular template or dashboard is to give us a high-level document to be able to give us some perspective on our metric status. So it's just designed to be able to communicate information at a very summary level. Now, each of these metrics then relates to much deeper information that could be accessible via other detailed reports. Now, this particular version is the metrics are grouped by risk type, and even though I have been very cautionary about using risk types throughout this whole video series, this does make sense. Number one, this is how we organize our risk appetite, is using the risk type, and so it's a good way when we start with our metrics to go back and group metrics this way. Again, it doesn't mean that a metric only references one type, but there's typically one where it leans the heaviest. And what we're trying to do is find a series of metrics that are good representations for that particular area of risk. But we're going to see how we do incorporate risk type more broadly as we go. Now, the list that I'm using is just a representative sample of metrics, and we'll see as we go here. I'm not suggesting these are the best metrics ever. Yours will certainly differ, but it's a good sample to use as examples of what we're going to look at. The primary dashboard, whatever it is, should really show your main metrics, the ones that are the most important, the most highly correlated to risk. Metrics that are more secondary could be moved to kind of a secondary part of the report. What we want to be able to show here is really those that are our principal metrics that give us an indication of status. Now, having said that, there's also no law that says the metrics have to always be the same. If you feel that a metric is really no longer informative or it's just perpetually green, fine. Think about moving that to a different part of the report, maybe incorporating other metrics that are in motion or would yield better information. But in the end, as is the goal with any tool within our risk management program, the goal is to create discussion, dialogue around where are we going and how do we feel about it. All right, so let's dive in and look at some examples here using some of our credit metrics. And again, some of the little component elements here that I want to kind of talk through. So starting in the second column there, it's just a short sort of reiteration of what kind of appetite is for this risk area. And again, I just find that to be helpful for reference, just to sort of provide a little narrative around what's the risk philosophy for each of our types of risk, just as a grounding element before we start thinking about the various statuses. Then we've got our list of metrics, and again, this is designed to be, I don't want 30. The idea is I want a small handful at 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever it is, just to give us a representative indication as to where we think we are in different areas of risk. Now in the example here, I show 3 metrics that are pretty conventional, and below that I have just a little narrative that kind of summarizes the perspective on tolerance. You could put whatever you want. In fact, what actually may be more helpful is instead of that is maybe you could put the metric name and then just a little sentence about again what that metric means. Just to give again somebody a reminder as to why that metric is important. But again, put whatever you want. I want to skip over the status column for now and talk about the values over on the right-hand side. So obviously we've got our three threshold values, in this case a yellow, an orange, and a red. And again, as a general rule, I like this because, again, the yellow is generally the keep an eye on it. The orange is generally let's talk about it and decide if we should make changes. And the red is the thou shalt not cross kind of threshold value. And then we've got our actual values, obviously. And, pretty conventional is 4 periods of data. It can be 10, it could be 2. Again, it doesn't really matter. I just find having, 4 periods is a good idea, if nothing else, just to give us a sense of trending. And then based on that information in column F there, a little chart showing the trend. This I find is incredibly valuable because, while I can look at values and sort of see the trend, I mean, nothing really beats an image. And I like to use a little graphic that contains not only, points for each of the 4 points of data we're using, but also some lines that can show what are the thresholds for yellow, orange, red. Just so, again, I've got a good visual representation of, where we at. As we can see here, most of these are fine. They're well below the yellow threshold, and I've got one that has ticked up. And so obviously at minimum, I want to understand why. Now, when we start getting into status, we've got 2 different kinds of statuses, and this is where it's really important to understand the difference between the metric status and the risk status. Again, those are not the same thing. So underneath each of the actual values, I've got a little color bar. And in this case, I'm fine using just a color, the green, yellow, orange, red, because really the only indication as to where is that value in relation to those thresholds. Once it crosses a threshold, it goes from green to yellow to orange to red. But that is not the risk level. That is only the status of the metric. And this is also why I say in the column there around the various thresholds, yellow, orange, red, do not put low risk, medium risk, high risk. It doesn't work that way. All this indicates is the metric has changed. So the colors underneath the actuals is just the status of the metric. Then what we do is we need to translate it into a risk perspective, and that's what we have in column E. Now, for the risk status, we've got to get away from stoplights. It's green, yellow, orange, red. I don't ever want to have another debate about whether it's yellow or it's orange. I don't care. Once we've come to a perspective on what we think the related risk is, I'm a much bigger fan of using a gradated scale like this, just so I don't have to spend arguing about whether it's green or yellow. Just put the slider where you think it is so we can create some dialogue. Again, the beauty of the visual here is I can look at this and I can immediately see, based on both the trend line and where the slider is, where we need to focus on. What's sitting comfortably in green versus where has something changed. So this gives me the ability to consider why might this be green or yellow, and looking at factors beyond just the metric itself. Again, I want to go back to an earlier example that I used, just heart rate. If my heart rate is up, does it mean I'm dying or does it mean I'm working out? So there can be legitimate reasons why a metric might be in the yellow or the orange or the red, but there's a reason for that, and it doesn't necessarily mean the risk is higher. In the same way, a metric could still be in the green, but if there are other factors that need to be considered, something that's coming and another element that create risk, I have the ability to show that risk as higher. And then once we've got our individual metrics and we come to some perspective on risk, then we can come up with an overall conclusion. We can see it over in column A. So for credit risk in general, yes, even though I've got a few things that are ticking up a bit, overall I feel like we are in good shape. Now again, that status right there can represent several things. That could just be an aggregation of the metrics we are tracking, or it could also include information from other sources as well. Again, this could go either way. There could be other information that isn't reflected here in a metric that could influence whether I want to state that I think our risk level is low or is gaining is high or whatever. Also in that example, you notice a little diamond I've got right there. That's an option too. What I could do there is I could put some sort of a marker or indicator from my risk appetite documentation that shows kind of where we want it to be, just to see where we are in relation to current status. And the last thing I want to point out here, and quite possibly one of the most important things on here, is these bars underneath the individual status indicators. And what those represent is those are pulling from the documentation tab and are reflecting what our view is on the risk correlation for that metric. So using our examples here, past due loans is an almost perfect correlation with potential credit risk. If that number is going up, that is a very strong indication we could have a higher indication of risk. When we look at some of our concentration metrics, even though that one is going up and is sitting at the top end of the yellow range, it really only partially correlates to an event that could take place. So right here, this gives me the ability to weight how I view these metrics, because the ones I'm going to weight the highest are the ones that have the higher correlation values. We can also see that down below in our metrics around interest rate risk. Those happen to be metrics that are fairly highly correlated with potential problems. So this gives us the advantage, again, of not just being able to see what a status of a metric is, but also being able to consider which ones we should be paying the most attention to. So now that we've looked at the components, I want to look at some examples of where this should tell a story and should support dialogue that we have, again, about where we're going and how we feel about it. So we talked about the category of strategic risk, and again, that is a big bucket. It includes a lot of things. And so I like to break the bucket of strategic risk down into a series of sub-buckets that can give us a perspective on strategic risk overall. And included within that is, capital, and what is our appetite for risking capital? Earnings, are we willing to risk earnings for a future benefit? How fast are we willing to grow, etc. And we look at some of those top ones, this tells a pretty good story. Our capital is in pretty good shape, trending a little bit down towards the latter period there, but still, again, fairly strong. Our earnings are okay. Again, we're seeing a slight decline there, but again, there may be reasons for that. And, growth is reasonable. It seems to be picking up a little bit, but again, we still seem to be well within thresholds. But then something interesting happens when we look at some of our other areas that I'm a big fan of, and it's metrics related to the overall business model, as well as our strategic initiatives. And are we willing to bet the bank on a given initiative? And this tells an interesting story here. When we look at some of the metrics related to those two categories, some pretty good metrics are, for instance, product risk rating. What is sort of the highest risk rating of the products that we offer? And we see something interesting there that, we've been well in the green for some time, but all of a sudden we've got a big spike here. Well, maybe we've begun offering a product that is riskier than we've done before, but perhaps in an effort to expand our offering or create additional revenue, we're trying something new. Again, this tells a story. Same thing with our customer risk rating. All of a sudden, we're onboarding some customers that are perhaps a different profile than we've had before. So this in and of itself doesn't mean that we're going off the rails, but it does mean the complexion of our business is changing. And that's mirrored by some of our initiative ratings, our average project risk ratings. So all of a sudden, this is ticking up. Similar, the number of our active projects. All of a sudden we're taking on a lot more projects. Again, in and of itself, this doesn't necessarily mean there's huge risk, but this tells a good story. Something is changing. Clearly, we've made some strategic decisions to go in a new direction or go into deeper waters. That's fine. This allows us the opportunity to talk about it. And the last of the component elements that I didn't mention earlier was, if we look below each of these sections of metrics, there's a section here for comments. And basically, anytime a metric is either not where we would like it to be or going in a direction that we don't like, then we always want to see some management commentary to explain why that is. And I've often heard, well, yeah, but we talked about that. I mean, come on, we know the rules. If it isn't written down, you don't get credit. It's really as simple as that. I want to see something in writing from management that speaks to these. Either, yes, we know this is in a higher risk area, but here's why, or it's there for the time being, but it's going to come back. Now, if some of these are trending into new areas and we say that's kind of what we think is the new normal, this tells me we need to go back to our risk appetite framework, and we're going to have to rethink what those thresholds are, because clearly they are now something different than where they started at or where they have been. And finally, when we start thinking about different types of metrics, the operational risk area can get a little tricky. And that's for two reasons. There's a lot of aspects of operational risk that aren't necessarily easy to measure and monitor, and there are just a lot of moving parts. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one is, as I said before, I'm not really opposed to using some qualitative metrics in addition to our quantitative. I know some people are not a fan, but I think this does accomplish something important, and it does create the opportunity for some transparency and discussion. So as an example, if I was looking for a kind of a benchmark on my third-party program here, one of the metrics, particularly when it comes to areas that have a governing element such as a program, I don't have a problem having a metric which is what we think is the state of the program. In this case, I could use a graphic which is a check mark as we feel it's strong, where the yellow, orange, red could be maybe an exclamation point, a double, and then an X. Again, those are subjective, but it does allow for some accountability that when we're discussing this, we can say, okay, this has gone down. Why? What's the concern here? And why do we think the risk level has increased? Is there a problem with the program? Are we having challenges? Is it understaffed? Whatever. Combined with some of our more quantitative, my vendor risk ratings are going up. Again, that might be reflective of if we're going into deeper waters with some products, then maybe we're taking on some vendors which are not quite as blue chip as the ones we've historically used. Our number of critical vendors is suddenly going up. Why? So again, I'm okay with the idea of incorporating a few subjective metrics. You just want to be very clear about why you feel the metric is in that condition, and is there something that we need to do about it. Now, coming back to some of our core metrics here, there's a couple other elements that you can consider in addition to the ones that are shown here. In the status on the overall risk area, say for credit risk, you may consider having two sliders. You could have one that shows what we think is the aggregate of our various metrics, and we could have another marker that is what was the last enterprise risk assessment we did. So we could see, is there a difference between where we were as of that point in time versus where we are now? That's an option. In addition here, you could decide to include who is the risk owner on here. That's perfectly fine. You could also include some information about correlation. Like I said, I'm using these little bars here as a quick visual reference as to what the correlations are we think on these metrics. You could include some short little description as to why you think that is. I'm not a fan of that because, again, I try to be very judicious as to what I put on here. I want it to have immediate information, whereas more reference information would be separate. And so the information we built in that documentation tab, I'm a very strong believer in including that at the back of this report. So if somebody wants to go and say, I don't remember how we defined this metric, I don't remember what were the correlations we used, I've got that available if I want it as reference. Also keep in mind that when it comes to the history of our metrics, we have to accept the fact that there could be times when tolerances changed. And so, for instance, my 2 periods ago may show as yellow, even though the number is in line today, it just means we might have changed the target thresholds. If so, just put a note in here to explain why it doesn't align with the thresholds that are as of today. Okay, so before wrapping up, I just wanted to very quickly point out a couple of other tabs in this workbook that I find helpful when building metric reports. The first is this risk appetite tab, and all I really have done here is carried over the information from our risk appetite framework, where we developed some standards around where we would like our levels of risk to be, as well as, at the time where we had sort of estimated they were. The important thing here is, again, this takes us back to where we established where we would want our risk levels to be. And this is a good reference that, again, we could consider using in our dashboard to put a marker around where that was. And again, this could be information that could be helpful to put in an appendix of report. So if somebody's curious, where did we establish our appetite, our threshold levels, this is the information that we could refer to. Okay, and here's the last tab, and I realize this is incredibly busy, but don't worry, we're going to walk through this. And I will say that this is really focusing on deeper risk analytics. So if analytics isn't really your thing, look, just feel free to skip through this section. So what we have here is an aggregation of all of our metrics. This is all of the metrics that are contained within our dashboard. And we've identified, what is the primary risk type that it's been bucketed into, as well as an appropriate sub-risk type when appropriate. We've captured all of our various metrics here, and in addition to these metrics, what we've done is we've brought over what are the various correlation values from the documentation. So again, for within each of the documentation tabs, we identified what we feel are correlation values to different types of risk. And again, while we've taken our metrics and we've put them organizationally into one risk category just to give us some organization, as we said, metrics can have an impact or influence on different types of risk. So by doing that, it allows us to use this information in a deeper way. So if we come back here, I've got all of my metrics, I've got each of the correlation values, and then we've brought over what is the current status of each of these metrics from our dashboard. Again, the current value in relation to our various tolerances. And again, this is not a risk level, it's just the status of it relative to those thresholds. Again, it's a proxy of potential risk. So once we have this, what we can do is we can take that status and then we can apply it against those correlations and look at how it impacts us across different types of risk. Something with a very high correlation, that's very meaningful. If it's a very low or moderate correlation, not as much. But here's what we can do with this information. Again, even though I've got these metrics put into different buckets, I can say, show me everything that has, say, a credit implication. And that's going to largely be my credit metrics, so no real surprise there. Where this particularly comes into play is where metrics may have an impact on strategic risk, and what are those that have the highest impact. Those that might have also like an operational risk, and again, where might be the highest components or the highest impact. And for instance, compliance. And this is an area where, again, we can say a lot of risks, even though they might be in one of the primary risk areas, can have a compliance implication. So here's a good example. I've got a metric here that the state of the metric is in the red because of where it is relative to its tolerances threshold, but it only partially correlates to different risk types. So I can look and see how it relates from an operational standpoint, a compliance standpoint. And if I wanted to actually go so far as to build a calculation around estimating a risk level based on these threshold statuses, I could use this and incorporate elements from each of these to kind of come up with an aggregate. Now, how you work the math is tricky and can be debated because, again, this is not a perfect science. But if you wanted, you could actually build a fairly decent model taking into consideration. If I've got, a bunch of risks that are really weighing in on compliance risk, that may want to factor into how I come up with a conclusion about the overall risk for that type of risk. All right, just a few final thoughts to wrap up this series. I want to reiterate, and I mentioned this in a prior video, that while a report like this does represent a kind of sort of form of a risk assessment, it really isn't a true risk assessment. It's really more of a risk status. It's limited to what we already know, and unlike a true risk assessment, it doesn't turn over any new rocks to see what crawls out. To use the car analogy, it only shows me the gauges I put in place. But if I hadn't thought to put a gauge in place to measure some other aspect of the car, there may be still some risks accounted for. So we need to understand what its limits are. Again, it's only helping us monitor things we've already identified. Second, remember your audience. There's nothing wrong with having one version of the dashboard for executive management and the board, maybe one that's a bit more granular for more middle management. Make the report audience appropriate. Next, focus on what matters. Have the discipline to justify any metric that you're using. Again, that's the advantage of that documentation tab, is it really forces you to think about, why are we including this metric and what does it tell us? Remember, the goal is for leading indicators, ones that are highly correlated with potential events. Remember, this program should help you in making decisions, and that's where leading indicators come in, because they give some indication about possible future events. You have to have clearly defined, visible thresholds. What is yellow, orange, red, and then what are the associated management actions with each of those, and particularly where those are defined by some sort of policy. Dashboards should tell a story, so try and remove as much ambiguity as possible. The question is, where are we going and how do we feel about it? And are we operating within the guardrails of our strategic plan and our risk appetite? Remember, metrics are one data point, but risk monitoring involves a variety of inputs, not the least of which is smart people thinking on their feet. The metrics are a starting point, but the discussion is about risk. Again, the value is in the discussion. The numbers and the pictures themselves are nice, but it should lead to a discussion. Remember, metrics have to be interpreted. Don't assume that everyone will come to the same conclusion about what a current state means. A metric simply tells you that something has changed. Your job is to figure out why and does it matter. And finally, remember, this should be a management tool. A page full of perpetually green metrics, could indicate you're just hyper-conservative or question whether you're really measuring the right things. Conversely, metrics that are perpetually yellow, orange, red means you aren't being honest about your risk appetite. The current state is your appetite if you aren't going to do anything about it. Metrics could be legitimately yellow, orange, red, or even on purpose, depending on the circumstances. They just need to be explained. But a cultural norm of metrics should always be green means you really aren't serious about risk management. In the end, just use common sense. Once again, thank you for watching. I hope you found this series on metrics to be beneficial. As always, I welcome comments or emails, input from you as to whether you found other methods to be able to make metrics more effective within your own organization. Keep an eye open. Got some very exciting information coming up, some announcements on some new content, as well as the ability to actually purchase the templates you saw in this series and a whole bunch of others. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, as always, please do me a favor and like this video. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, as those really do help us get this information out to more people. Thank you.